Hi, my name is Dallan Petersen, and I'm going to be discussing a paper that I wrote on Alaska Native student graduation rates. I was interested in this topic because I'm an educator by profession, and I believe in the value of and the power of education. So I want to begin with a story that I read about Evan Peter. Evan is now the Vice Chancellor for Rural Community and Native Education at UAF. In 1989, a group of Alaska Native boys were sent to talk to their school counselor. Evan Peter and the other boys had recently started seventh grade in Fairbanks. You are more likely to end up dead or in jail by the time you're 25 years old than you are to finish high school as an Alaska Native male, the counselor told them. In 2016, Evan Peter reflected that today the underlying statistics of this threat remain similar for Alaska Native youth. The majority of Alaska Native students graduate high school, but an alarmingly high number do not. The goal of my research was to examine some of the major obstacles that prevent many Alaska Native students from graduating high school. Statistically, American Indians and Alaska Natives have the lowest graduation rate of any race in the United States. Factors that prevent many Alaska Native students from graduating high school include historical trauma, poverty, having a parent who did not graduate high school, substance abuse, adverse childhood experiences, and a history of child abuse or neglect. Another important factor in Alaska Native graduation rates is the chronic teacher shortage and high rate of teacher turnover here in Alaska. The high school graduation rate for all students in Alaska is about 78%, but the graduation rate for Alaska Native students is significantly lower at just over 60%. This is a major issue for Alaska Native people because people that fail to graduate high school face many negative consequences as a result. Without a high school degree, the economic outlook for young Native peoples is at best bleak. Today, job seekers enter a market where the average wage for individuals without a high school degree is far lower than it was 40 years ago. Some other negative consequences of not graduating high school include higher rates of unemployment, earning less when employed, being more likely to receive public assistance, being more likely to suffer poor health, and being more likely to have higher rates of criminal behavior and incarceration. Understandably, many Alaska Native people have a painful relationship with Western education. For generations, Alaska Native youth were forced to leave their families and attend boarding schools. And it was believed that removing Alaska Native youth from their families was for their own good because it would help them assimilate more quickly. At boarding schools, educators tried to Americanize the Alaska Native students by forcing them to abandon their cultural beliefs and values. Evan Peter writes that education was introduced to our people as a tool of U.S. colonization and assimilation. Schools and religion were the primary mechanisms to attempt to eradicate Alaska Native languages, cultural practices, values, and identity. Evan Peter further explains that boarding schools were rooted in the tenet, kill the Indian, save the man. This introduction to education was traumatic for many Alaska Native peoples, and it contributes to current issues of intergenerational trauma and tension in our people's relationship with Western education. Many Alaska Native people still experience traumatic stress that is caused by historical trauma and discrimination. The painful experiences of their ancestors still affects the views of many Alaska Native people towards Western education and public schools. One educator in rural Alaska pointed out, for some, walking into a school building brings up pain. They may not even realize it because it may not be their pain, but it may be the pain of their parents or grandparents. Another major obstacle that prevents many Alaska Native students from graduating high school is poverty. Students living in poverty are less likely to graduate from high school than students from wealthier families. Poor students are 5 times more likely to drop out of high school than students from high-income families. Alaska Native students are more likely to face the obstacle of poverty than people of other races in the United States. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 26.2% of American Indian and Alaska Native people were in poverty in 2016, the highest rate of any race group, whereas for the nation as a whole, the poverty rate was 14%. It stands to reason that people living in poverty would have a harder time doing well in school because of the adverse conditions that often accompany poverty. These include high mobility and homelessness, hunger and food insecurity, parents who are in jail or absent, domestic violence, drug abuse, and other problems known as toxic stressors because they're severe, sustained, and not buffered by supportive relationships. As an educator, I know that one of the theories that we talk about a lot in student achievement is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Adapted for schools, Maslow's theory posits that students cannot achieve their academic potential until their basic needs and psychological needs are met. If a student is living in poverty and experiencing toxic stressors, then they're less likely to be able to achieve their academic potential and to graduate high school. Students are also less likely to graduate from high school if their parents did not graduate. The failure to complete high school has intergenerational implications on socioeconomic attainment because children whose parents did not complete high school are more likely to perform poorly in school and eventually drop out themselves. Thus, many Alaska Native families may find themselves trapped in a cycle of poverty. If parents didn't graduate high school, they're more likely to live in poverty, and if they live in poverty, then their children are less likely to graduate high school. Another major obstacle that prevents many Alaska Native students from graduating high school is substance abuse. Students who abuse drugs and alcohol in high school are more likely to drop out. Substantial evidence has accumulated that clearly supports the role of substance use as a contributory factor for dropout. Moreover, clinical experiences, with substance using adolescents reinforce the notion that drug use leads to declines in academic motivation, study habits, and goal setting. Substance abuse likely plays a factor in many Alaska Native students dropping out of high school because Alaska Native and American Indian youth are statistically much more likely to use illicit drugs than their non-Native peers. Native youth also tend to use alcohol earlier, use it more often and in higher quantities, and experience more negative consequences from it. Norm Wooten, the executive director of the Association of Alaska School Boards, attributes part of rural Alaska's low graduation rates to the state's high rates of alcoholism and opioid use, particularly in rural areas. Other major obstacles that prevent many Alaska Native students from graduating high school include a history of child abuse or neglect. Studies have found that people who are victims of abuse are more likely to drop out of high school before graduation. Studies have found that Native children had significantly higher rates of maltreatment, including child abuse and neglect than any other race. American Indians and Alaska Natives are disproportionately affected by childhood trauma, including abuse, neglect, and family violence, with pronounced disparities between white and Native youth. Perhaps one of the most important factors in Alaska Native graduation rates is the chronic teacher shortage and high rates of teacher turnover in Alaska. As a state, Alaska struggles to attract and retain enough qualified teachers to fill student needs, especially in rural districts where the vast majority of Alaska Native students live. This affects the quality of the education that students in rural Alaska receive. Recent research confirms that a stable and quality teacher workforce is directly related to student achievement. Unfortunately, the United States has been facing a teacher shortage for years, and this directly affects Alaska Native students. Fewer people are going into teaching, and quality teachers are in high demand across the country. Also, many people who do go into teaching leave the profession within 5 years. In the United States, up to 25% of beginning teachers leave the teaching field before their third year, and almost 40% leave the profession within their first 5 years of teaching. This has led to a massive teacher shortage in the United States. The teacher shortage in Alaska is even worse than in the United States as a whole, especially in Alaska's rural school districts. For years, rural school districts in Alaska have struggled to recruit and retain quality teachers. This has a direct effect on Alaska Native students because about 80% of the state's Native Alaska students live in rural districts. Part of the issue is a supply problem. Annually, Alaska school districts hire about 1,000 teachers, but Alaska's teacher preparation programs only graduate about 200 teachers. This means that each year between 70 and 80% of teachers hired in Alaska were trained in another state. And this situation is likely to get worse before it gets better because the University of Alaska Anchorage's education school lost its accreditation last year. Alaska's current budget crisis suggests new or improved teacher preparation programs are not coming anytime soon. Teachers who come to Alaska from out of state tend to be younger and less experienced teachers who are just starting out in their career. Most of them don't stay longer than a year or two. The national average for annual teacher turnover for a school district is 8%. But many school districts in rural Alaska have annual turnover rates between 20 and 30%. In the Arctic region of Alaska, about 60% of teachers leave within 2 years. This high rate of teacher turnover in rural Alaska school districts is detrimental to the academic success of Alaska Native students. Most teachers reach their peak of effectiveness between 5 and 10 years. And high turnover is synonymous with inexperienced teachers and ultimately results in decreased student achievement. To be successful, Alaska Native students need teachers who understand their culture and know how to teach them in a culturally relevant way. Teaching students in Arctic Alaska in ways that allow them to keep their cultural identity is vital for student motivation, curriculum relevance, and ultimate community and cultural stability. Unfortunately, this is often difficult to attain because the majority of teachers in rural Alaska are from the lower 48, and generally they're unfamiliar with Alaska Native culture before they move to rural Alaska. So due to the high rate of turnover, most of the teachers are leaving by the time that they really learn how to teach Alaska Native students in a culturally relevant way. For teachers from out of state, adjusting to life in rural Alaska can be difficult. Teachers often report feeling lonely and isolated after moving to rural Alaska. DeFeo points out that teacher turnover affects communities as well because residents are unwilling to invest in creating relationships with educators who they believe will be gone in a year or two. And so this leads to a cycle of teachers feeling unsupported and not integrated into the community, while concomitantly, community members perceive schools as distant and disconnected. If rural schools in Alaska were able to lower teacher turnover and maintain an effective and stable teacher workforce, this would likely increase Alaska Native student achievement and lead to an increase in graduation rates. As an educator, my hope is that Alaska can find a way to decrease teacher turnover. Since 80% of Alaska Native students live in rural Alaska, I believe that more than anything else, maintaining an effective and stable teacher workforce in rural Alaska would significantly increase graduation rates among Alaska Native students. Although there are many factors that prevent many Alaska Native students from graduating high school, having great teachers who love and understand them would make a huge difference for Alaska Native youth. So these are my references, which I have cited. And here are the URLs for photo credit for the photos that I've used. All right, thank you for watching.